Okay, so I thought I'd put together a quick video on how to remove the rear subframe from a Ducati Panigale. This is an 1199, but I think it's still the same for the 1299. I think there's just one bolt different under the tank, which I'll come to. The reason I'm doing this is I took the exhaust off, and full caveat, this is the second time I've done it, and I thought it's quite useful to have an explanation as to how to do it. So yeah, I've already done this, and the reason I did it was to take the exhaust off to sort out a heat shield issue. You can see there that I also took it off and cleaned it up. But what I found when I put it back together was that I couldn't get to the bolts to put the rear heat shield cover back on. So I'm gonna have to take it all off again. So I thought I'd video doing it. With regards to tools and what you need to take it off, 4mm and 3mm Allen key. This is a torque torque bit, T40. I've got two of those because one of the bolts is slightly harder to get to. You do need quite a long extension, so I've bolted a few of these together. You also need a 10mm spanner. I'm using a 10mm ratchet spanner. So what I'm going to do is, the instructions are the same for removing and also for loosening the rear subframe so that you can pivot it up out the way, and you can get to the heat shield underneath. The first thing you need to do is loosen this surround from the ignition barrel, and the idea is that we're going to lift the tank up. Lifting the tank up will allow us to get to the bolts under here, and also to loosen the subframe bolts and then lift it up out the way. So it's a 3mm on either side, and then a 4mm here. Sorry, a 4mm here. So I'll do this, and then we'll come back to the next bit. So I've loosened these bolts, so now the cover around the ignition barrel should come off. We'll pop this down here so that we can keep it separate. What we're also going to do is loosen these bolts. The idea is, and you don't need to do this necessarily, but it does make it a lot easier. We're going to loosen the bolts so we can pivot the tank up. We're not going to take it off, but what we're going to do is loosen those bolts. And I believe, actually, but I missed out at all, you're going to need a 5mm as well, because I think from memory those bolts on the front are 5mm. So let me just grab one of those. Now I actually didn't tighten these down, but all you need to do is loosen these two off, which they should be loose already. And the idea is that we're going to pivot it up on this pivot point here. The next stage is to take this retainer off that holds the tank down, so that we can pivot that tank up out of the way. So this is just an 8mm. Take that off. Not easy doing this with one hand. Incidentally, if you want to take the seat off and you're not sure, it's a 3mm bolt just here. You pull the seat cover back, undo that, and the seat just pops off. So those two off, and I believe the remainder are 4mm. Loosen those. There we go. And what I like to do is just take that and we'll pop it down with the cover, just so that we have all the bolts together. I'll just pop these back on for now, just so that we keep everything together. And then the next phase is to lift the tank up. And what that'll do is it'll give you clearance here so that you can then move the tailpiece about. If you're not taking the tailpiece off, it's easier. It's easier just to pivot the back up. If you do want to take the tailpiece off, you can probably leave the tank on, but I'd say just to move it out of the way and save scratching it, it's often easier just to have it and pivot it up out of the way. So now we've got the bolts loosened. As you can see, I'm using a hugely professional gardening fork to hold the tank up, and I do this just because it's a beveled edge, so it doesn't damage the frame, and it's the only thing I've got to hand. Not particularly professional. Once you've loosened the bolts that I showed previously, you do need to unclip. There's a couple of clips here. There's one here, which you just pop off. And there's a clip underneath that goes into, I can just move that out of the way. There's a socket just there, and this unplugs. And what I'd suggest is once you've unplugged these, you just pull them out of the way. Pretty straightforward. So the next piece of the puzzle is undoing. We have 4 bolts holding the rear subframe on. You've got one just behind the shock here, hence the long extension. There's one on the other side matching, but obviously you don't have the shock reservoir shock reservoir in place. And you've got 2 bolts here. All of these are using a T40 torque bit. They're a bit of a faff, especially this one, and just be super careful when you take it out, because I believe it's an aluminium bolt and an aluminium block, and it's quite easy to strip the thread. So yeah, be super careful. Okay, so loosened all the bolts off. I've taken these. You want to loosen, especially if you're pivoting it. Easy enough to loosen these as much as you can all the way out. This bolt I found will stay in there. Incidentally, that is the bolt from the other side, so the equivalent on the other side. It's quite a long thread. I didn't realise when I first did this and couldn't understand why I wasn't getting much movement in the seat unit. So do wind it all the way out. These bolts here, you just need to wind out enough so that it'll pivot it, unless you're taking the whole thing off. Now, if you are taking the subframe off, you obviously need to take these all the way out, and then you've got to clip into the ECU under here that you need to undo. I'm not going to undo it now because I like to undo that as little as possible, bearing in mind that that's the ECU just there. Undo that and the whole subframe will come off. As it stands right now, so that I can get to the heat shield, this will now pivot up and allow me to get to that annoying heat shield at the bottom and get the bolts back in it. Thanks very much.